Welcome to part 2 of our discussion on the election of 2016. Back in late March, we had an event which is identical to this one in terms of format and most of the panelists, where we began to discuss the election, broadly speaking, including the events leading up to the election, the candidates, the issues, and some of the consequences in the aftermath of the election. So we're going to continue that discussion today. I'd like to introduce the panelists from your left to right, if I have this right. Yes. This is Mr. Bob Brown. He's a professor of history and English here at Tunxis. Dr. Rafaele Fierro, who is professor of history and also coordinator of our general studies program. Mr. J.I. Abbot, professor of philosophy and English. And then last but not least, Mr. Romuald Byczkiewicz, who is a lecturer in history, longtime lecturer in history here at Tunxis. So you got some pretty serious brain power here. The format will be the same that we employed back in March. It's a question and answer session. So rather than you simply listening passively to our lecturers, although that would be interesting, what we're really encouraging you to do is to ask questions. So in just a moment, we're going to start that process. Any question you have about the election, again, it can be the events leading up to the election, the issues, candidates, parties, conspiracies, not too kooky, please, but something that might have some plausibility, or consequences of the election. You're free to ask the panel, or you're free to ask a panelist if you have somebody in mind. So let's begin, and we'll see how far we go and what we touch on. Does anybody have a question? Good. Here.
This may be a silly question. I don't know. I was wondering if anyone thought the impact that Saturday Night Live skits had any impact on the election. After I thought it was a slam dunk. I thought Hillary was going to walk away with it after the skits, but I was wondering what your thoughts were, if enough people watched it, or what your thoughts were on the skits on Saturday Night Live.
Well, I think in the past, Saturday Night Live has had quite an impact on elections, but this time around, it didn't as much. And I think it just speaks to the Trump brand that he seems to be immune from a lot of the criticisms and satire that would bring most political candidates down. He's kind of like the Teflon president somehow. His supporters stick with him to the end. They stick to him as well. And come hell or high water, they are behind him. And even now, after 3 months or so, almost 100 days of his presidency, he continues to maintain that basic level of support. I think there was a recent poll that came out that said that if the election were held today, who would you vote for? And his support is still around the same. About 43% of people continue to support him. He once said that I could shoot someone on Fifth Avenue and my supporters would still support me, and I think that's certainly true. So as far as Saturday Night Live is concerned, I don't believe that had an impact at all. Alec Baldwin was the character who portrayed him, and you'd think that would sink him, but if anything, it just mobilized his supporters even more, and it made them even more angry at the status quo, at the establishment, and I think SNL is seen as part of that establishment, and they were more determined to support him in the wake of such satire.
I also think that the Saturday Night Live's demographic is not Trump's demographic. I think that, and I know that Alec Baldwin's skits were played on late night shows the following week, news shows the following week. But I agree with Rafaele. I think that Trump's base is Trump's base, and the people who watched and laughed on Saturday Night Live at 11:30 are probably people who weren't going to vote for Donald Trump anyway. So I think that there's a separate demographic constituency there, so.
It occurs to me that, Trump he's a satire of himself in a sense, isn't he? So maybe that gives him an immunity against satire. The scowl, the hair, the off-the-cuff remarks and so on. So it just occurs to me without really thinking that through that maybe that makes it really, really hard to satirize him.
My favorite Saturday Night Live skit, by the way, was nothing to do with Alec Baldwin's portrayal of Trump. It was an episode in which they featured the show Black Jeopardy, and they had 3 black panelists and Tom Hanks playing a Trump supporter. And I thought that was very spot on. It also pointed out that once below the surface, you got the same sort of paranoia in both constituencies, and I thought that was the point of the skit. So, while they look to different candidates and different different sets of issues, deep down there's a common, well, as Fran said, conspiracy theories are entertained here, but I think that's in both communities you get a sense of conspiracy, a sense that forces larger than us are shaping our events, or people larger than us are shaping our events.
Saturday Night Live and late night comics have had a field day with Mr. Trump, but it raises the interesting question as to whether or not pop culture has any influence on political attitudes and opinions. And today I think it depends on which pop culture or which aspect of broader political culture you subscribe to. And every one of them has their own constituency, every one of them has their own representatives.
It's been observed that Mr. Trump, of course, has had a business relationship with professional wrestling, and his personality, in many respects, mirrors that of wrestlers in the WWE. Part of the appeal and part of that tenacity with which Trump supporters stick to him is like a wrestling fan base. The more outrageous he gets, the more viral he gets and more popular he gets among his base. So I think that kind of narrative can't be ignored, really. That, again, this is in line with what some of my colleagues have said about Trump as an entertainer. It's really a big part of this larger narrative.
Another question. Go around the room, sort of.
So I'm wondering, in the aftermath of the election, with President Trump's nomination of Neil Gorsuch to the Supreme Court and his confirmation to the Supreme Court, what the panelists feel about the rule change now with the nuclear option being used by the Republicans. How do you feel or do you feel at all that there's going to be a shift in the Supreme Court in the coming years, and how do you see that playing out under the Trump administration?
Well, Justice Gorsuch fills a position that was created when Justice Scalia died. And I think that the appointment of Justice Gorsuch will probably have no material impact at this point. The real issue is going to be the next vacancy. And the next, several of the more liberal members of the court are getting up there in years. Ruth Bader Ginsburg has health problems. I think that the court will tilt if she leaves before the Trump presidency ends, rather dramatically.
Right, we sort of addressed the issue in the last round of our forum. And one thing I maintained at that point was that Gorsuch would be nominated, but we didn't really talk much about the nuclear option, which is what the Republicans exercised. For those of you who don't know what the nuclear option is, in the past you needed 60-plus senators to support the nomination of a Supreme Court candidate. The Republicans changed the rules so that a simple majority would be enough. And because they hold control over the Senate, they got that simple majority, changed the rules, and put Gorsuch through. So that's what happened, and I was actually probably a little inaccurate when I said that the Democrats would not try to resist the Gorsuch nomination as much. because they don't want to waste their political capital now when they would be better off down the road saving it for the real fight coming up to change the balance of the court if and when someone like Ruth Bader Ginsburg retires. And by the way, a Republican senator said that this summer, someone on the Supreme Court is going to retire. He didn't mention the person by name, but a lot of people think it's, if it does happen, that it will be Ginsburg, and that will completely change the dynamics of the court. So in any case, that didn't quite happen the way I thought, but it did lead to the nomination of Gorsuch. And so the next time around, you can rest assured that the Democrats are going to do everything in their power to resist. There's really no other way around the nuclear option other than to appeal to the Democratic base and to try to get as many people mobilized against a replacement for Ginsburg or whomever with a more conservative judge. But that's the direction the court is headed. It's headed toward I think, toward a majority conservative point of view. You know, when the retirement happens, if it happens, who knows? But certainly, we can bet there are going to be some major changes on the Supreme Court moving forward.
And the fact is, the reason that Supreme Court appointments are, or any federal judicial appointment is so contentious is because they serve for life. They're there until they retire or they die. And there's been some speculation that a couple of them even held on in the past after they had died. They didn't want to go. So I think that, and you know, in partial defense of the Republicans, I think that they were willing to push the button that I think many people would have hesitated to push, the nuclear button. Democrats had done it during the during the Obama administration when the Republicans had a majority in the Senate. Not appointing a Supreme Court justice, but appointing judges to federal district courts and appeals courts. They had suspended the 61 vote requirement for that. And so, you know, there was precedent for doing it.
Other questions? That gentleman had his hand up, excuse me.
First, I wanted to say thank you, panelists, for. Okay. First, I wanted to say thank you, panelists, for having us today. I appreciate it. I wanted to ask, how much do you think Russia played a part in the election? How much do you think they skewed it? How much do you think they played with it? What's the conspiracy theory?
I personally don't like conspiracy theories. I'm very much opposed. Talked about this in my U.S. history since World War II class yesterday regarding 9/11 and the conspiracy theories that are floating around. Conspiracy theories, by definition, are impossible to disprove, and they're very ahistorical in that regard. They're very anti-empirical, so you can't gather enough evidence to disprove it. So I really don't like dealing with them. But regarding Russia, there was certainly an attempt on the part of the Russians to delve into the election and probably to influence it in favor of Donald Trump. I will acknowledge that just based on what I've read, based on the evidence that I see. But you asked specifically, Mark, whether the election was influenced by Russia delving into it. And I would say there's no evidence to suggest that the outcome of the election changed as a result of Russia's attempt to kind of infiltrate it. So as far as I know, unless my colleagues here say something different, I don't think the outcome would have changed if there were no Russia. I think Donald Trump would still have won. Lots of people would still have been incredibly angry about it, especially since he did not win the popular vote, only the Electoral College vote. So I don't think the outcome would have been any different from what I've seen.
I'll jump in. I would concur with my colleague, Dr. Fierro, regarding Russia's involvement. There is no direct evidence that Russia's influence or interests in the election altered the outcome. It has been demonstrated, however, that Russia has been involved in elections throughout Europe. Russia financing often many what would be termed ultranationalist, or what I would term as neo-fascist parties and movements. Yes, I have dropped the F-bomb, and I think the F-bomb is appropriate in these circumstances.
Not that F-bomb.
Yes.
Not that, no, fascism.
one that
Fascism
follows-
is the F-bomb.
and
That's
A-
an even worse F-bomb than the actual
Yes, it
F-bomb
is.
you were all thinking.
Yeah, this is the one where
It's
the
a
A follows
scary
the F.
F-bomb. As we've seen Russia's involvement in the recent French presidential elections, supporting Marine Le Pen's National Front. Russia has been actively involved in politics in Hungary, somewhat stayed away from politics in Poland, despite the fact that Mr. Kaczynski and Mr. Orban of Hungary have met together and declared a cultural counter-revolution, which shares many sympathies with Mr. Putin's cultural counter-revolution. Where Mr. Trump and Mr. Putin seem to share characteristics or affinities is a certain outlook, I guess, or a certain set of attitudes that would link them to what I would term neo-fascism.
I can only concur with what both Ram and Rafael said, but I would point out that there's a certain irony in work in the world today because you saw the explosion of anger from Russia after Trump ordered the missile assault on Syria. I think that several points could be made here. First of all, you really can't count on Donald Trump to do anything predictable. Correct. If you think you have built a relationship with him, you haven't. I think that's clear. And Putin, to the extent that he thought he had done so, was going to be disappointed. Was going to be mistaken at some point. And the second thing is, I think that the response, I think that the nuclear assault the missile assault on the air base in Syria was appropriate. I think it was proportional. I think it hit the base from which the chemical gas planes had departed. It put that airfield out of action. But I would say also that, and then this, to go back to the point about Mr. Putin, there's a certain incoherence in Donald Trump's foreign policy. There absolutely is. He ran as a candidate for president saying, America first, it's not our job to police the world. And then what does he do when he sees pictures of babies burned in a sarin attack? He orders a missile strike. There needs to be a certain level of consistency where it can be predicted that you will do something in this circumstance. I don't think anybody can feel that any consistency from Trump at all.
Yeah, I want to kind of piggyback on that just briefly regarding Russia and Syria. When Donald Trump ordered the bombing of that air base in Syria, as one political observer said, that's the moment he actually became presidential. And I think there's some degree of accuracy to it. I believe that was a proportional bombing, that the United States did what it had to do when it comes to chemical weapons. There is a red line there. Although it is striking that there are lots of problem points in the world that are completely disregarded by this country. So there's a certain unevenness in American foreign policy when it comes to that. I also agree with what Professor Brown said in terms of Trump's inconsistency. And he has that type of personality, which I think concerns me on some deep level, that one day he's your friend, but if you cross him in some way, then he becomes your worst enemy. And that may be well and good when it comes to interpersonal relations, but when it comes to shaping American foreign policy, that can be a very dangerous thing. And I think we really have to be alert to that fact that there is a lack of cohesion in American foreign policy. And so while one decision here or there may be the accurate and appropriate decision, still that lack of cohesion can come back to hurt this country.
Take another question.
Everybody, is it on?
There we are.
Hello? Testing. All right. Everybody hates taxation. It's a very vital component to actually what structuralizes government. Trump just put a sort of blanket taxation plan that lowers the taxes on everybody, basically saying that more money in the pockets of the people would make for a better economy. What is the likelihood that this will actually take more money out of public service, education, and anything that's really government funded, and actually counteract and do the opposite of what he claims?
Too bad we didn't have Professor Blazinski here, who's our
absolutely.
economist. He could comment, but
I do have some numbers just as far as the tax plan goes. This is what it proposes. So just for some context, the plan is to cut corporate taxes from 35%, which is the level they're at now, to 15%. Okay, so that's a very substantial cut in corporate taxes. Okay, the other part of the plan is to cut the 7 income brackets down to 3. So it would simplify the tax code on a somewhat major level. There is another portion of it that calls for the abolition of the estate tax. Okay, so that's another part of it. Now, it's been lauded by some more conservative-leaning places. The U.S. Chamber of Commerce, for example, believes that it would go far in stimulating the economy and making things work better, creating more jobs. But on the other hand, what the plan has been criticized for, and I think accurately, is the deficit that it would leave. Apparently, according to the Committee for a Responsible Federal Budget, the plan could lead to a loss in government revenue of about $5.5 trillion, which is very significant. That's over 10 years. Still significant when you consider the debt is at upwards of $18 trillion today. So there's really no accounting for how this is going to be paid for. The only response that Trump officials have had is that, well, if you stimulate the economy, which they believe this plan will do, that will create jobs, and that will create a major source of revenue in the long run. But, you know, these predictions are really hard to, you know, it's hard to know whether they can come true or not.
First of all, I think that whether a tax plan emerges and is passed that in any way resembles what Trump put on the table yesterday is problematic. I think that there's a lot of negotiation debate to occur before that happens. And again, unless the Republicans want to revoke the filibuster entirely, then there aren't support. I don't think there will be support in the Senate to approve anything that looks like Trump's tax package. I would say this too. Every indication is that you know the priority of the Trump administration, and it's been stated by Secretary of the Treasury Mnuchin, is basically, yeah, we're gonna gut domestic programs anyway. We're gonna slash the EPA. We're gonna cut funding to public broadcasting and a variety of areas. We're just gonna cut. That is the priority. So that's gonna happen regardless of the tax cut. I would also say that not everyone would gain. I mean, it's not a blanket cut that cuts taxes for everyone. One particular demographic that would not benefit, and I know about this because I'm in it, is upper middle class people living in high tax states, because those high taxes include state and local taxes, and they would no longer be exempt or deducted from our federal income tax. So that's going to eat up any savings we might see otherwise. So, you know, it's not going to be good for me. And it's not going to be good for people who fall into my demographic, middle class and upper middle class taxpayers. So.
The political side of this is also interesting because Bob just mentioned that, will the Democrats support it? He may not have enough political support. The question of whether he works with Democrats or not is up in the air right now. Some say that if he can managed to convince Democrats that he would increase services in certain areas that they support, then they may support his tax cut, or maybe not as big of a tax cut for corporations. Maybe they can come over to his side. But there is something also known as reconciliation, and the Republicans, again, they control Congress. They may implement what's called reconciliation, which would require not 60 votes in the Senate, but a simple majority, a lot like the nuclear option that they exercised with the Supreme Court nomination of Gorsuch. So it remains to be seen what happens here, but I just think there's a lot of political posturing going on behind the scenes, and who knows how this will all pan out. It's interesting, though.
Reconciliation, by the way, is also the process by which Obamacare was passed.
Right.
So it's been done before on major policy items, so.
Let's take another question. I think there were a couple of people up here who had their hands up.
Hello? Yeah. I was volunteering in the Bernie Sanders campaign, and I was really sad when he lost. But it gave me a feeling of something was like intervene, because for what I hear, it was really convenient that Hillary will go against Trump, because we thought if Bernie will go against Trump, we will win. What is your opinion about that?
There were a number of polls during the primary season that showed Sanders would have been a stronger candidate, actually, if he was the nominee. Now, the question is, the polls were wrong in terms of predicting a Hillary victory. Almost all of them were wrong. So they might have also been wrong about indicating Sanders was a strong candidate. It's a great question, though.
I think it's a great question, to be very honest, looking forward at the movement that Senator Sanders created. I think that we can speculate about a lot of things from now until whenever, but the real challenge we face in such scenarios is that we can, in proposing kind of what are frankly alternate universe kind of scenarios, alternate timelines, if this had happened.
Historians like to do that, by the way.
We do, yeah, and that's something that's, and it's valuable as a thought experiment, as an exercise, but I mean, then we do have the question of Republican opposition, and we do know historically that's a factor that can weigh in very, very heavily. There can be all manner of approaches to attacking a candidate, so it's really hard to say precisely. I think that there was tremendous populist appeal and a tremendous movement, and it's not quite certain right now what's happened to that movement. But I think there's something in an alternative within the Democratic Party, which some debate is even part of the Democratic Party. It's hard to say what that is, but I think that for myself anyway, I've chosen to kind of look at that issue. I did support Senator Sanders in the primary season, and I've speculated a lot about this, and I've not come up with any definitive answers, unfortunately, just because I don't have that kind of psychic ability, and I don't mean to be dismissive in framing it that way, but there's just so many other variables that would come into it. So I think looking forward is a very, very appropriate approach if one is a supporter of Senator Sanders and the movement he created.
I don't think he would have defeated Trump. No, I don't. I mentioned this in the last forum we had, where Sanders was strong. He may have been able to challenge Donald Trump in the Rust Belt area, Ohio, Wisconsin, Pennsylvania, but then he would have had a very difficult time in states like North Carolina and Florida. The further south you go, the less popular Sanders is. And that would have been a very difficult obstacle to overcome politically, electorally. So, it's just a prediction. We really don't know how it would have all unfolded, but it seems to me that he had a basic weakness in the South, and you need parts of the South to win the election. Donald Trump won Florida, he won North Carolina, he defeated Hillary Clinton in those states, and that really helped push him over the top. won Virginia as well. There's no indication that Bernie Sanders would have defeated him in Virginia. Now, I mean, if he had gotten the nomination for the Democratic side, maybe he could have galvanized some support in those areas, but there's no evidence, as far as I can tell, to support that. But I will say, though, that Bernie Sanders, as Professor Abbot just said, he represents something bigger than a candidate running for president in the year 2016. He's part of this populist trend that is international in scope. He's part of the same phenomenon that Donald Trump is a part of. This idea that, you know, average people are sick of those in power, those who are entrenched in power, who ignore the desires and the will of the people. They're fed up with it. And you see it not only in this country, manifestations of which are Bernie Sanders and Donald Trump. You see it in France. Le Pen is a candidate. She may surprise people and win the elections that are coming up in May against the mainstream candidate there, Macron.
Macron.
Yeah.
Emmanuel Macron.
So, you know, that's just one example, but there are populist uprisings everywhere in the world, including beyond the West. And so Bernie Sanders is a senator from the tiny state of Vermont, but he represents something a lot bigger than that.
I just wanted to continue on Professor Fierro's comment. This is a global phenomenon we are seeing. When I speak of neo-fascism, this is simply one aspect of this sort of populist rejection of modernity or global free trade or global cultural values and attitudes. Attitudes are often far more cosmopolitan, far more open-minded, that are now being attacked by these various populists. You have populists on the left that are attacking globalization and global trade, populists on the right, evident in a number of neo-fascist movements that attack cultural plurality, emphasizing instead a sort of an ultra-nationalist attitude or agenda, often sets of attitudes that are very closely linked to the fascism of the early 20th century. And it's not just in France. And Emmanuel Macron is also a novice to electoral politics in France. The traditional political parties in France, the Socialist Party and the Liberal Party, I believe, they've lost. And the Conservative Party lost considerably. François Fillon just barely lost to Marine Le Pen. And we're seeing this in Germany, we're seeing this in Poland, we're seeing this in Hungary, in India, with Narendra Modi and the Hindu Nationalist Party that has been in power for several years, and in the Philippines. Rodrigo Duterte was elected last year on a populist agenda to do away with drug dealers and drug users, and he's authorized extrajudicial killings to realize this. Now more than 7,000 people. Just the other day, he was indicted by the ICC, the International Criminal Court, for authorizing these EJKs. So it's a scary phenomenon we're seing. This,
he gives bounties.
Yeah.
You know, you can kill somebody suspected of a drug dealer and collect payment. So.
I just want to say I agree with that assessment completely. I mean, there are very powerful right-wing, ultra-right-wing movements across the globe. There's no doubt about it. But I think what I'm interested in are the things that give rise to it. What causes this to happen? And so some data for you that I think should alert all of us to the problems we all face in our communities. For every one American aged 25 to 55 looking for work, 3 have dropped out of the labor force. Okay. There is a detachment in communities that we see across the country, across the globe. The labor force dropouts spread, these labor force dropouts, those who have dropped out of the labor force, they now spend 2,000 hours a year watching screen time, whether it's television, computers, rather than what they used to do, which was to look for jobs. There are no jobs to look for anymore. They don't perceive that there are jobs out there for them. You don't perceive that there are jobs out there for all of you. So that's part of the problem. Half of these people who have dropped out of the labor force are on some type of pain medication daily, which gives rise to what? The opioid crisis. So it affects all of our communities. And it's that kind of detachment that has led to the failure of modern-day 21st century institutions taking care of its people. And when people don't feel that they're being taken care of, they will lash out in anger. And that's why you see Bernie Sanders, Donald Trump, Le Pen, what's her first name? I always forget. Marine. So those things are happening, certainly, and it's something to be concerned about, but we should look at the root causes of it because it's impacting all of us.
I think that's the larger question. What are the root causes? Why is this happening now? The economic factor, I think, is an important one, but it doesn't answer all the questions we have. Pankaj Mishra has just written a book entitled The Age of Anger, which is his attempt to describe why you're having this sort of cultural reaction against modernity associated either with global economic transformations or cultural transformations. He provides some interesting insight into this question. I don't think he provides all the answers to it, but I think it's worthwhile reading. The library here is ordering it, so I encourage you to look it up and read the book itself. He ties it into the Russian nihilist movement of the 19th century, the nihilists who embraced violence, believing that modern global changes, the Industrial Revolution, could not improve their lives because they weren't seeing any benefits. How many of you are seeing benefits from global free trade?
Right. Well, and you may not know what the
Yeah.
benefits are.
Exactly.
Actually. Or the liabilities either for that matter, unless it directly impacts you.
I also think the assault on modernity, there's a weird sort of psychological component to that shows up in people's responses to problems. Like the most popular thing that Donald Trump proposed, I think, during the campaign among his followers was to build a wall. A wall is a very old, archaic method of providing security. It probably doesn't work. But when we think about walls that keep people out, we think about the Great Wall of China, which was built in the 3rd century. So we're talking about.
It could be a metaphor for everything we're talking about.
We're talking about a 3rd century technology here, being brought forward into modern times, and that's not original with me. I heard it on NPR this morning, but I thought it was a point worth making. We are looking ever backwards. And the point was made by a congressman from Texas who actually supports tighter border security, and his point was we should be using electronic devices and drones. That's the modern technology. So
The virtual wall.
yeah, the virtual wall as opposed to the physical wall.
I think that we oftentimes have trouble looking beyond Trump and, the president and beyond. I'm wondering if the panel could maybe shed some light on the current makeup of the Senate and House of Representatives, and with the 2018 midterm elections approaching, not so far into the future, what that might mean for a Trump presidency or for policy going forward on either side of the aisle.
I would say this. First of all, to look at the midterm elections, the party in control usually loses seats. I think that for the Republicans to lose control of the House of Representatives, you would have to have a massive transformation in the political structure of the country. And people who are Republicans would have to become Democrats. And I say this because, first of all, very few districts, relatively few districts, congressional districts in the nation are actually competitive. The other thing I would say is the real story of congressional politics the past 8 years has been that the Republicans snookered the Democrats after the 2010 census. And the census is used to determine how many representatives each state gets. But within that broad rubric, it's the state legislatures that decide how to draw the districts. And Republicans put massive efforts into congressional races, into state House and Senate races that would pave the way for the redesigning of the districts. And basically what these Republican state legislatures did is redesign districts to give themselves continuing majorities forever. And that's a very smart politics, but it means that the Democrats should have been paying attention and they weren't. And I think that that's going to be something that they pay heavily for going forward. So.
Yeah, that redistricting is a major reason why the Republican Party controls so many seats in the House. And also at the state and local levels, the Republicans tend to dominate. They control about, what, 2/3 to 3/4 of the governorships of the 50 states. So they've certainly had their way with politics these days. They still control the Senate by, what, 5, 6, 7 senators. The House there's a rather large gap there. But the thing is, if the Democrats cannot get their base out to vote in the upcoming 2018 elections, then nothing will, because the hatred of Trump is so visceral that I would imagine that the Democrats are going to come out in droves, and they're going to win some significant number of seats in the House and probably turn back a few seats in the Senate, too. That would be my prediction at this point. Of course, lots of it depends on factors that have nothing to do with the Democratic or the Republican Party. How well the economy does moving forward will matter. If there are signs that the economy is strengthening, you can probably bet the Republicans will maintain their control of both houses. If the economy enters into a recession, the reverse may happen. So a lot of circumstances are out there that may determine the outcome too.
I still say I would be very surprised if either house changed hands. I would be. And then the most interesting statistic from the congressional races in 2016 is that more people who voted in congressional races voted for Democrats than voted for Republicans. But the Republicans won because they had districted their states effectively. So, and that's why it's going to be very hard for the Democrats to achieve a majority, though I do agree that they'll probably gain some seats.
If I remember, I could be wrong about this. I've heard this statistic a couple of times, that the Democrats will be defending something like 25 Senate seats in this election. It's a really large number. So that's a really tall task to hold on to all of those seats. So that could actually give the Republicans a built-in advantage. But again, it does depend on so many other factors. Let's take another question.
Because Trump's strike on Syria was such a contradiction to his foreign policy, do you think that he did that for humanitarian reasons, or he has an ulterior motive? I just want to hear your thoughts on that.
And just get the sense that Trump always has an ulterior motive to something. Look, I think there is enormous political pressure on him to do something. He has tried at every turn, at least rhetorically, to distinguish himself from his predecessor. You may recall that President Obama warned Assad to not use chemical weapons against his own people, and Obama called that a red line. And shortly thereafter, Assad used chemical weapons against his own people. And there was no military strike against Syria when that happened. And I think President Obama paid an enormous political price for that. I think he got criticized by a lot of people. It seemed to reflect for some a weak foreign policy, one in which, you know, not only do you not live up to your word, but also you allow the Russians to come in and dictate what happens in the Middle East. And so I think that contrast that Trump wanted to paint between he and his predecessor was a motivating force to why he dropped those bombs in Syria. He may have been motivated by a genuine concern for the Syrian people. I don't know that we can automatically dismiss that. Trump is a human being. He may have some feelings. He saw those children suffering in the streets of Syria. Although it's interesting that we don't necessarily assign emotion to Trump in ways that normal human beings have emotions. I don't know. He seems to be this kind of a caricature. But that may have been a factor as well. It's interesting also that there were some Trump supporters, visible supporters. Laura Ingraham is one of his most outspoken supporters during the campaign. She was very much opposed to those bombings. because she felt he was much too guided by the emotions that those pictures carried with them. And so there are a lot of so-called neocons who didn't exactly like that interventionist approach that he took. So, I mean, there are several factors as to why any one political leader in Trump's position would make the decisions he does. There's never just one reason.
And I'd say that yeah, I think that the biggest blot on Obama's 8 years in office is that he drew a red line and then erased it. I would have had no problem if he had simply, after the first chemical attack, launched missile strikes against bases in Syria like Trump did. The problem is that he said he was going to do it and then he didn't. As for why he did it, yeah, I think Trump is, I think, an emotional man, yeah. And I think that he perhaps was touched by the pictures, the images that he saw. But I also think that on another level, there was a strategic aspect to this decision. He wanted to signal to the American people that I'm not in Vladimir Putin's hip pocket. I think that was I think that was probably a factor too. I can be independent from him, so I can make him angry.
Piggybacking on Professor Brown's remark, has the audience heard much about the investigation into collusion with Russia, the potential for the Trump campaign's collusion with Russia since the attack, since the bombing of Syria? We haven't heard much at all. I'm reminded of President Clinton's bombing of Sudan on the eve of Monica Lewinsky's testimony in Capitol Hill. I mean, these are very effective tactics, and as much as we can scrutinize and say, hey, that's what's going on, it's very effective. And, and so we cannot dispositively conclude that that's what happened. But we do know that there hasn't been much airplay about Russia since that time. There just hasn't been. I mean, just proportionally, we're not seeing as much of that, so.
I mean, the Syria response, I also put in a broader context. I see a president who is determined to regain the military option as leverage that can be used against countries, an option that the previous president was extremely reluctant to employ. So in that sense, he's a kind of a traditional Cold War, post-Cold War president, where really that attack was largely a diplomatic response. I mean, it was a military attack, but largely I believe it was sending a broader diplomatic message that the United States can and will use military force to achieve foreign policy objectives. And he was sending that message not only to Syria, maybe to Russia, but to the whole world.
The other point too that it occurred to me that when after the first time Assad used chemical weapons when President Obama was in office, the course of action that the Obama administration took was to solve this issue diplomatically, to enter into negotiations and get Assad to give up his chemical weapons freely. And there was a lot of boasting going on that in fact happened, that, we solved this diplomatically. Susan Rice in the Obama administration publicly touted this as the way to do things right. Lo and behold, a couple of years later, he's using chemical weapons again. There's an historical lesson here in that some people you just can't trust. I mean, especially when it comes to dictatorial regimes around the world, the last thing you want to do is just take them at their word. And that is, I think, instructive for North Korea as well, because we've had years and years of both Republican and Democratic administrations trying to solve that problem peacefully, diplomatically, and yet we're still dealing with a nuclear North Korea. And so, trust but verify is what one president used to say. But at the same time, it's really hard to verify what's happening behind closed doors when you have such closed societies as in Syria or North Korea.
Young lady had her hand up.
This question kind of goes back to the previous question about Bernie Sanders, but I think a lot of his popularity came from young voters and the younger generation. So I think the majority of people who supported him weren't yet able to vote for him. But there's a lot of people who believe that younger people who weren't able to vote previously are potentially going to throw the political climate in the future. Do you believe that the Republican or the Democratic Party is beginning to lose its momentum in the younger generations?
I think the Democrats would like to claim that demographic. Whether they can do it, I don't know. I mean, it strikes me that the Democratic Party, and to a certain extent the Republican Party, but the Democratic Party is of two minds about many things. There's the faction, the Sanders faction, Elizabeth Warren, people like that. But there's the more traditional mainstream Democratic element that is much older and frankly seems to still be the driving force in the Democratic Party. So no, I don't think that they'll be able to. I don't see that happening with the Democrats unless a lot of young people register as Democrats and change the party's focus, you know. But that's what would have to happen.
I would say this era in which we live is crying out for a third-party movement, and I'm surprised that it didn't happen in the 2016 election. Then again, Trump is kind of a third-party movement of his own. He just kind of co-opted the ideas of the Republican Party, even ones that he previously disavowed and was critical of. But I think moving forward, the opportunity still presents itself for a third-party movement. And I think young people are the ones who really should lead the way in that. And the problem is that, you know, 18 to 29-year-olds don't often vote as often as those in the older age brackets. But if there's anger among millennials and others out there, you should use that and channel that in a manner that creates an alternative to the two-party system. Because if what we were saying is accurate, that there's this anger out there, this rage against the institutions that exist, there's no better way politically to challenge that than to form an alternative to the two-party system, which is a symbol of entrenched power. So that would be my advice to people, especially in your age category.
I think that, you know, we have this inclination towards the possibility of change, and I do agree with Dr. Fierro that stepping into the polls and voting and following through on that has perhaps been a challenge, but there was not the enthusiasm for Secretary Clinton that the young people showed clearly for Senator Sanders. Senator Sanders sort of had this, again, image of the, if you will, badass grandfather. That was a lot of what it was. My grandpa's a real badass. Something like that, you know, that he was willing to challenge the existing institutions or the corruption of the existing institutions. And if one noticed really the play that some of these memes got, which kind of starkly contrasted how cool Bernie Sanders was vis-a-vis how kind of uncool and not with it Hillary Clinton was. And there was just sort of a proliferation of those, you know, that kind of were out there. I mean, I think this is something that's very, very powerful, you know, as a concept, sort of whether people are in touch. And I think that we're all kind of in touch vis-a-vis smartphone culture. This is something that's an astonishing shift in civilization. We have to kind of look at it this way. The millennial generation coincides with the most significant technological innovation in human history. Huge thing. Sort of over the time I've been at Tunxis, when I came in, a tiny fraction of the student population had smartphones. Now I don't think there's anyone in this room, likely, there might be one person who doesn't have a smartphone. And so, you know, the political candidates who are able to kind of, again, align their narrative and their message with the capacity of technology, the capacity of something like Snapchat, for example, you know, to spread a message. It's not any simple combination of these things. It's really innovation. We know that Barack Obama did significantly better than John McCain in 2008 by advertising in video games. You know, you'd be playing a racing game, and there'd be sort of Obama signs on the side of the road and this kind of thing. These are not minor things, but it's not any one single kind of platform or approach. It's an aggressive and a kind of visionary embrace of the range of strategies one can employ to really tackle this theme of populism. You know, sort of that's a reality, and it seems to be a reality. How does one tackle that from a variety of different fronts? And I think that's where it's going to be to this generation, regardless of where you stand. I don't want to frame this solely in terms of one political direction, but this generation has the capacity to transform everything with its imagination. So we want to look to the imagination, the political imagination in particular, to address our current situation.
You do raise a very important question in terms of the role of young people in politics. Young people have been a part of mass politics now for nearly a century, and we see it also in the early 20th century. This is what often motivates and provides energy to various political movements ranging from the left to the right. The direction young people go in the future, I think, is open-ended. Populist anger seems to be quite prevalent among young people. The general disgust with the existing political parties seems to be universal, if not almost universal. Where young people can go, they could go either to the Democrats or toward restructuring the Democratic Party, or they could go to the Conservatives or the Republicans or the Libertarians. It's not going to be channeled toward any one political direction. So we have to be careful about our assumptions that we make about young people and their political predilections.
I will say also, it's not just about politics. I mean, young people are known for being complacent politically and not going to the voting booths when they should and all that, but I would urge you not to be complacent in your own lives and building your own careers and doing what you can. There's an interesting new book out by Tyler Coan is his name. It's called The Complacent Class, and he has some interesting data on the lack of ingenuity and creativity. It seems like we've lost our spirit as a people, and this is especially impacting young people. One statistic that was glaring to me was that since the 1980s, young people under 30 years of age, the number of them opening up their own businesses has declined by 65%. It's just one of many pieces of data he gives to suggest that, we seem to have lost our way. Speaks to the kind of anger and resentment and the sense of deflatedness that's out there. But in our everyday lives, what are we doing to be tenacious and to be as hardworking as we can? That's always a message that I think should resonate with young people. And it often these days doesn't, because oftentimes we are sent the message that the deck is so stacked against us that there's nothing we can do about it. And yet I think that's exactly the wrong message we ought to be sending young people. You ought to take the initiative, and you ought to do what you can to make your own little success story. And that's important. Shouldn't lose sight of that.
I got to cheerlead a second too. Bob, please.
I think the issue transcends politics. It goes to culture. And you certainly can change the culture in a variety of ways that exist independent of politics. And perhaps out of changing the society in certain ways, you can influence politics in the society. And I think it might be that the inspiration begins somewhere else and then filters into politics. But it's the culture is very big. There are many ways to make an impact, and that impact can manifest itself ultimately politically. So.
Keep in mind, if you don't get politically involved, if you don't vote, you're giving politicians a reason to take you for granted and to ignore you, quite frankly. And they will very often. And I'm sure Dr. Fierro would echo this sentiment. If you're interested in politics, get involved in your local town. I mean, both parties are always looking for people to do things. And that doesn't necessarily mean run for office, so you might even think about that. But there are a lot of ways in which you can get involved at the local level and make a significant impact on your town or city.
There's a city councilman in Bristol Calvin Brown, who won election when he was a student at Central. And, and he's been in for, I think, 3 terms now. But, yeah, his political career started when he was 21 years old.
Might know the mayor of New Britain, who I think will be 30 this year, who's serving her 2nd term. Pretty remarkable story.
Tunxis alumnus on the city council, New Britain, as an advisor to the mayor.
Yeah.
Yep.
Sure. Please.
We just have to figure who had a hand up first, but.
Yes.
Go ahead.
Well, the situation in North Korea, I believe, I'm just curious, that paid strategic planning is over and we're pulling back the red line. Is there any possibility of conflict at all?
I suspect that it won't snowball out of control. And I have only past history to base that on. You know, the leaders of North Korea, whether it's the current leader or past leaders, they know what they're doing. They're not these irrational actors that we sometimes think they are, and that they're just loaded guns waiting to go off. They calculate what they do, and they take things to the brink in exchange for some sort of China giving them something, the United States giving into something. Remember, the North Koreans, they're starving. Their people are as poor as any people on earth. And so whatever concessions they can get from China to deliver food, to, for the United States to back off against North Korea, they would drive things to the brink just to do that. Now, I suppose that the thing that's changed now is Donald Trump. He's been called a loose cannon before. So will he take things to the point of no return? And I don't think so. I happen to think that as unpredictable as Donald Trump is, he's surrounded himself with some pretty decent advisors. James Mathis and Rex Tillerson, they seem to be fairly level-headed. You may not agree with their politics. So my point is that we've seen this before. The rhetoric now seems to be a bit different, but I think that the powder keg in the world is the Middle East. I think that poses a greater risk of more widespread conflict, and you see the sides aligning on that. Russia doesn't say much on North Korea, but Russia is every bit involved as any other country in the Middle East, opposed to U.S. interests at times. And it wouldn't take much for the Middle East situation to flare up. I think it would take a lot for North Korea to deliver a nuclear weapon to the United States, knowing full well it's going to get destroyed in response.
It's suicide.
It's suicide.
Yeah. I would also say this, though, from the from the perspective of the United States. North Korea is different from Syria. The United States has no close ties with the nations in the Middle East in terms of them being our allies or our friends. We have an ally. We have two very strong, important allies in that part of the Pacific, in South Korea and Japan. And that's where North Korea's attack would fall first if it felt provoked by the United States. I mean, they have artillery that can drop shells on the capital of South Korea, Seoul. And significantly, I think over the weekend, the North Koreans had a rather massive artillery demonstration, which sort of reinforces the point of what they can do. So I think that there are factors in the North Korea-United States relationship that would impel the United States to look someplace other than the initiation of conflict.
All right. I was talking to my mom this morning, and she mentioned something about Trump wanting to cut trading ties with Canada and Mexico. And I was wondering what you guys think would happen if he actually went through with that, considering that they're bordering both sides of the United States.
He had phone calls with Delaney. He had phone calls with the Prime Minister of Canada and the President of Mexico. I think yesterday. And he said, no, we're not going to do anything for now. What he's looking to do is to renegotiate NAFTA, to create a new version. And, you know, he is playing interesting economic games, too. He proposes to raise the tariff on soft lumber from Canada by 20% in retaliation for what he views as Canada's, the Canadian government's subsidy of that industry to the United States' detriment. So, you know, he's no free trader, and I think he ever has been. But I think that once again we might be seeing advice from more rational people about what's doable and what's not doable. So.
I think here you're also finding out the difference between campaign rhetoric, what he said during the campaign, and what actually happens when you're president. You know, when he spoke during the campaign, it was as if, you know, the other countries like Mexico and Canada had nothing to say about it, that he was going to do what he was going to do and they're going to pay for the wall and all of that. But the reality is much different than that. Mexico's not paying for the wall, as far as I can tell. And the only
we're not paying for it either.
We're not paying for it either. Apparently, we're trying to get members of Congress to agree to appropriate money for the wall, but I don't think it's happening. But one example, just a couple of days ago, word came out that Mexico may respond to this idea of a wall and these changes in the agreement called NAFTA by boycotting corn, because Mexico gets a lot of corn from the United States, and if it were to boycott that, it would hit the United States where it hurts. Its economy would be impacted by it. Mexican leaders have reached out to Brazil and other South American countries that produce corn. And so, you know, these countries are actors too. They have a role to play. They can exert some pressure, even though they don't have powerful militaries. They can do it in other ways that would certainly make Donald Trump think twice about what he's saying in terms of implementing his ideas. So.
We'll just burn the corn in our fuel tanks. We'll just
That's
burn
right.
more ethanol. Don't keep going on that, please. Please.
So politics has never been my strong point at all. I've always tried to avoid it as much as possible whenever somebody tries to talk politics with me. But concerning the current Trump administration, how should they, Professor Fierro, earlier you mentioned that we have, you know, a big unemployment population and there's an opiate epidemic, but there's also, with that unemployment population, a lot of that population is from people that are incarcerated and people that are ex-offenders that are recently released from prison. And according to the U.S. Department of Labor, 30% of our population, adult population, have criminal backgrounds. And I know you said you're trying to figure out where all of this came from, and a lot of it was from prior administrations, from Nixon's. Like, I don't have to, you guys are all history majors, but like.
No, keep talking. I'm getting it.
So President Nixon's.
We need a question.
War on drugs. Okay, so. How should they instead of criminalizing low-level drug offenses, like saying this person has a drug problem and incarcerate them, there should be more efforts to help them, rehabilitate them.
Right.
How should this administration address that?
Well, the quick and glib answer is this. I remember back in the 1960s, a senator from Vermont, a man named George Aiken, had a solution to our growing Vietnam dilemma. He said, declare we won the war and get out. I think the same thing is absolutely appropriate to the war on drugs. Hey, we won. Nobody's doing drugs anymore. Let's end the issue. But on a more serious level, yeah, it's a crime that so many people are in prison for nonviolent offenses. It's a crime that people are in prison for drug possession. They should not be there. The key to dealing with that particular population is indeed rehabilitation. And I think that any move in that direction is a good move. I do think that there's there's still a profound anti-drug sentiment in society that spills over onto the drug culture more generally. So I think it's very hard to initiate change, but I do think more people are talking about it. So I think, yeah, rehabilitation first for people who haven't committed a violent or potentially violent crime using drugs.
That's certainly the national trend, and we see it here in Connecticut as well, that there's this movement toward taking those offenders, those drug offenders, out of prison and toward rehabilitation. There's no doubt that's the direction in which we are headed. Connecticut, for instance, since 2002, has gone in that direction. The problem is the change is very slow, and meantime, you're spending a lot of money on the prison population. You know, it's interesting. We spend money in these areas, and then, you know, we spend money in Hartford on the yard goats, $70 million, $80 million, but we don't spend money on rehabilitation services for prisoners who have drug records. So sometimes it's a slow change, and it comes over a long period of time. But the other thing is that, you know, old habits die hard, and we still live under this very archaic system where no matter what the penalty, what the offense, you're going to go to jail. And the harsher the penalty, the better it is for society. That's, I think, we're beginning to see that old way of thinking no longer holds water, and it's at the very least not economical for us to keep things as they are. So in some sense, Connecticut is one of the leaders, one of the trendsetters in moving away from that archaic system and toward prison reform.
And this is sort of ad hominem, a little bit off the point, but it's the perfect time to make this point. If we had a sane prison policy, we could fund higher education. Simple as that. We have an insane prison policy, and we can't fund higher education.
Yeah. I honestly don't know, though, where Trump stands on it. He hasn't said much about it. I get the sense that he's not going to be spearheading reform of it anytime soon. He has a few very high priority goals that he's focused on. I don't think prison reform is one of them.
He's called himself the law and order president, and he has sided repeatedly with proponents of cracking down further on drug offenders. So there's been that overall pattern. You say you're not politically, you said to tend to avoid politics, you're not as politically involved. But I would just suggest the great 20th century political philosopher Leo Strauss, and he was controversial, but he was brilliant, once called political philosophy the queen of the social sciences. If we kind of think of every act, of every human kind of decision as having some political dimension to it, as being political, we may be less reluctant to immerse ourselves in politics. Politics is messy, and life is messy. But there's some sense in which we look at this kind of perspective of a throwaway population. It has deep philosophical and theological roots, this idea, largely stemming, I would argue, from the Puritans. This idea that someone is sort of damned and we can just sort of dispose of them and throw them away. They're going to hell anyway, by the way, so we might as well just stick them in a hole. We have this incredible prison culture that's unparalleled anywhere else in the world, and a lot of it is based on a very specific kind of judgmental framework, and we're not even conscious of how much this influences us. So we can get further involved, and you can get involved as individuals and influence your legislators. It's very, very vital to kind of step into the fray, I think, on these issues.
Getting back to your question, I don't think Mr. Trump is going to be spearheading any efforts at reform at this point. He's delegated that role to his Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, who's made statements in recent weeks, more or less reasserting federal authority on drugs, on drug policies.
This would be another discussion unto itself, obviously, which is a worthwhile one. So maybe we'll do that in the fall. We'll see.
Yeah.
Unfortunately, we're just about out of time. Some people do have other classes to go to teach and so on. So I want to thank everyone for coming today. I want to thank everyone who asked a question.
Thank you.